Alona, with a big welcome to you. First up, how is the meeting playing out in Russia as President Putin heads home?
Well, for Russia, something that the government wants very much is to be a player on the world stage, right? And so the fact that a meeting like this even took place between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin is already a positive sign. And Russians who are currently feeling the effects of economic sanctions being placed upon them very much want to hear that there is going to be an improvement in relations between Russia and the United States. That's why you saw people kind of welcoming the election of Donald Trump with open arms. It's not so much that people were opposed to Hillary Clinton, but that they saw a candidate in Donald Trump who was promising that he wanted to better relations. So right now, people are looking at this as a positive step, but there were also lowered expectations going into it because Russian sanctions and lifting them, that was a non-starter given the current political situation here in the U.S. and what Congress is trying to do to tie the president's hands. And so, you see the same thing in the Russian press and in the newspapers, reading into body language and body language experts talking about it. And most of that is just because optics are the main thing we have to go on. There are only a few people who are in that room, and they're the only ones who know what really happened.
So is that what President Trump got from this meeting? He got better relations, or at least the perception of that. I mean, you make a very good point, all of those that you made. But in addition, let's face it, it was supposed to go for 30 minutes. It went for over 2 hours. So if it had been very contentious and they were not getting along, you can imagine either of them saying, I'm out of here, and moving. So there was something that happened there. So does that send a strong signal?
I think that for someone like Donald Trump, he has always had what I like to call strongman envy. And so I think that Vladimir Putin is a leader who he wishes he had the same amount of power as the way that Putin does in his country, because, of course, there is a strong system of checks and balances here in the United States, and Trump is facing a lot of political opposition. And so I think that probably Donald Trump wanted to be liked by Vladimir Putin, and that's why this went on for as long as it did. And we saw that they made jokes together at the expense of the media. And, so very much I think that this was Donald Trump trying to be a deal maker as a businessman, as he was, rather than necessarily a seasoned politician, which he's not.
I'm curious what you might know about how President Putin would have prepared for a meeting like this.
Well, my knowledge only extends to that of which I've heard from a lot of people who have worked within the Russian government, people in diplomatic circles who have had meetings with Vladimir Putin, with Sergei Lavrov, and with other Russian officials, and that's that he is somebody who prepares very well, and he is a tactician, and he goes in with a strong agenda. And you had some guests talking earlier about the fact that the United States didn't really have one in this case, and that's why I think that this is being perceived so much as a win for Russia, is because we weren't really sure what the United States could actually be getting out of this meeting.
In terms of the tenor, just a couple of hours or so before the meeting, the president tweeted this. Everyone here is talking about why John Podesta refused to give the DNC server to the FBI and the CIA. Disgraceful. Now, of course, there were some errors there in the tweet there, but do you think this might have been a way for Trump to try to bond with Putin? And how much does Putin rely on bonding over his common enemies?
Putin is not known to be a warm and cuddly guy, so I don't think that bonding is necessarily his usual state of play, but he knows that Donald Trump is somebody who has a big ego, and he wants to have that ego stroked. And so I think that that's what Vladimir Putin would be going into this meeting knowing about the person that he's sitting down with, is the type of personality and the type of character that he's dealing with. As for Donald Trump and the election news, I'm surprised that he even brought up the hacking issue at all, because I don't really see a benefit for the president to bringing it up, because people aren't going to be satisfied unless he were to come out and say that he was putting in new sanctions in place, right, against Russia. So nothing was going to be seen as forceful enough. And so perhaps he's just trying to play to both sides here. And again, the amount of secrecy that we've seen from this administration, the very specific way that this meeting was planned so that only a few people would be in the room and no note takers would be in the room, I think all lends to, what's currently playing out now, which is it's a game of he said, he said.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.